Louis XIV was a man who turned his most intimate bodily functions into elaborate state ceremonies, transforming even his morning bathroom routine into a privilege that nobles would literally fight to witness. This wasn't just royal eccentricity, this was power politics at its most extreme, where watching the king relieve himself became one of the highest honors in 17th century France. We're talking about the Sun King himself, Louis XIV of France, who ruled for 72 years and fundamentally changed what it meant to be a monarch. But here's what most history books won't tell you: Louis didn't just revolutionize warfare, architecture, and diplomacy. He turned his entire body, every function, every moment of his day, into a weapon of political control that would make modern dictators jealous. Picture this: you're 5 years old, and suddenly everyone around you is telling you that you're not just a king, but literally God's representative on earth. That's exactly what happened to Louis XIV in 1643 when his father died and left him the throne of France. But here's the twist: this wasn't just about putting on a crown and sitting pretty. Young Louis was about to learn that being king meant every single moment of his existence would become a public performance. The boy king didn't fully understand it yet, but his mother, Anne of Austria, and his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, were already setting the stage for what would become the most elaborate royal theater in European history. See, they had a problem: Louis was just a kid, and the French nobility were getting restless. They'd spent decades fighting civil wars called the Fronde, where aristocrats basically tried to limit royal power by force. These weren't just political disagreements, we're talking about actual battles in the streets of Paris, with nobles barricading themselves in their mansions and refusing to bow to royal authority. Young Louis experienced this chaos firsthand. In 1651, when he was just 13, rebellious nobles actually forced their way into his bedroom in the middle of the night to check if he was still in Paris and hadn't fled like his mother wanted to. Imagine being a teenager and having armed men burst into your room because they don't trust your family not to abandon the capital. That night changed everything for Louis. He later said he would never again allow anyone to see him in a position of vulnerability, which makes what he did later with his bathroom rituals even more fascinating, because he turned vulnerability into strength. But here's where it gets really interesting: instead of just trying to be a strong king through military might or political maneuvering, Louis and his advisors came up with something completely revolutionary. They decided to make the king's body itself into the ultimate symbol of state power. Not just his public appearances or royal ceremonies, but literally everything: how he ate, how he dressed, how he slept, and yes, how he used the toilet. This wasn't some weird personal quirk. This was calculated political genius. You see, the French nobility had been used to living on their estates, governing their own lands, and only showing up at court when they absolutely had to. But what if the court became so magnificent, so essential to social status, that they couldn't afford to stay away? And what if being close to the king, physically close, witnessing his most private moments, became the ultimate status symbol? By the time Louis was ready to rule on his own in 1661, he'd figured out something that no other monarch in history had quite grasped. In an age before mass media, before photographs or television, the king's physical presence was everything. But unlike his predecessors who tried to maintain royal mystique through distance and ceremony, Louis decided to do the exact opposite. He would make access to his body, even at its most vulnerable, into the most precious commodity in France. The genius of this system was that it solved multiple problems at once. It kept the nobility busy fighting over court positions instead of plotting rebellions. It centralized power by making everyone dependent on royal favor for social advancement. And it created a whole new form of political theater where every gesture, every glance, every moment of the king's day carried enormous significance. But most importantly for our story, It meant that Louis XIV was about to turn something as basic and universal as using the bathroom into one of the most sought-after privileges in European society. Because when you're trying to convince an entire kingdom that you're divine, even your most human moments need to become sacred rituals. Now here's where Louis XIV's story gets absolutely wild, and I mean this literally changed the entire concept of royal power forever. By the 1670s, when Louis was at the height of his power and had moved his court to Versailles, he had transformed his morning routine, including his time on what the French delicately called the chaise percée, into the most exclusive event in European high society. We're not talking about just any bathroom break here. This was a carefully choreographed ceremony that could make or break political careers. Louis would wake up around 8 in the morning, and what followed was basically the most elaborate bathroom ritual in human history. First, his personal physician would check his stool. Yes, you heard that right, because the king's health was literally a matter of state security. Then came the real show. The lever du roi, or the king's rising, was divided into multiple stages, each with its own hierarchy of access. But the most exclusive moment, the one that ambitious courtiers would literally spend years maneuvering to witness, was when Louis would sit on his closed stool, which was basically a fancy portable toilet, and conduct state business while relieving himself. Think about how insane this sounds to modern ears. The most powerful man in Europe, ruling over 20 million subjects, would invite selected nobles to stand around and chat while he defecated. But here's the brilliant part, this wasn't degrading to Louis's dignity. It was the ultimate power move. He was so confident in his divine authority that he could literally sit on a toilet and still have dukes and princes hanging on his every word. The invitation to attend these intimate moments wasn't random either. Louis used bathroom access as a political tool more sophisticated than any modern lobbying system. If you were a noble who'd been causing trouble, suddenly you'd find yourself excluded from the morning routine. Your absence would be noted by everyone else at court, and your political influence would plummet overnight. On the flip side, if Louis wanted to signal special favor to someone, he might invite them to witness not just his morning relief, but even more intimate moments. Ambassador accounts from the period describe grown men, war heroes, diplomats, bishops, literally trembling with excitement when granted access to Louis's bathroom ceremonies. The Venetian ambassador wrote home in amazement about watching French dukes argue over who got to hold the king's shirt while he changed clothes after using the toilet. These weren't just symbolic honors either. Being present for these moments meant you could whisper urgent business into the king's ear at the most relaxed moment of his day, when he was most likely to grant favors or make important decisions. But Louis took this whole system even further. He didn't just use his bathroom time for politics, he used it to demonstrate his complete control over his own body and, by extension, over nature itself. Court physicians would examine everything, documenting the king's digestive health as if it were a barometer of the kingdom's well-being. When Louis had constipation problems, it literally became a state crisis, with doctors consulting and nobles whispering about what it might mean for France's future. The most incredible part? Louis actually made this system work for over 50 years. By turning his most private bodily functions into public ceremonies, he created a form of political theater so compelling that nobles abandoned their independent power bases just for the chance to watch him use the bathroom. Foreign diplomats reported back to their own courts in amazement, describing a system where grown men would wake up before dawn just to position themselves for a chance to be noticed during the king's morning routine. And here's what really shows Louis's psychological genius. He understood that humans are naturally curious about the private lives of powerful people. Instead of trying to maintain mystique through secrecy, he weaponized that curiosity. He made access to his privacy into the ultimate luxury good, more valuable than gold or land. When you could watch the Sun King himself at his most human, you weren't seeing him as weak, you were being granted access to divinity itself. By 1682, Louis XIV had created something that had never existed before in human history, a palace specifically designed to showcase royal bodily functions as instruments of political control. Versailles wasn't just a home or even just a royal residence, it was a carefully engineered machine for turning the king's daily routine into the most compelling political theater Europe had ever seen. Let's talk numbers for a second, because the scale of what Louis built is absolutely mind-blowing. Versailles housed somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people on any given day, depending on the season and what events were happening. We're talking about a city-sized population all revolving around one man's daily schedule. But here's the crazy part, Louis designed the entire palace layout so that his private apartments, including his multiple bathroom areas, were at the absolute center of everything. The king's bedroom wasn't just a bedroom, it was the geographical and political heart of France. Everything radiated outward from there, and access to different areas of the palace corresponded exactly to your rank in Louis's elaborate hierarchy. The closer you could get to the king's body, the more powerful you were considered to be. And the ultimate symbol of that access? Being present for his most intimate moments. Louis had multiple closed stools, portable toilets, positioned throughout his private quarters, but the main one was in a small cabinet right off his bedroom. This wasn't hidden away like you might expect. Instead, it was positioned so that the king could continue conversations and conduct business even while answering nature's call. Foreign visitors were absolutely shocked by this arrangement, but for the French court, it represented the pinnacle of sophisticated power politics. The genius of Versailles wasn't just in its luxury, though my God, was it luxurious. We're talking about a palace with 2,300 rooms, 67 staircases, and 5,210 pieces of furniture, all designed to showcase royal magnificence. But Louis understood something deeper about human psychology. If you want to control people completely, you don't just control their work or their politics, you control their entire social environment. At Versailles, everything revolved around Louis's schedule, and that schedule was built around his bodily needs and functions. The morning routine we talked about earlier wasn't just a private ceremony, it set the rhythm for the entire court's day. Thousands of people would structure their entire lives around when the king woke up, when he ate, when he used the bathroom, and when he went to bed. But here's where Louis really showed his strategic brilliance. He made life at Versailles so expensive and so socially necessary that nobles bankrupted themselves trying to maintain their positions there. You needed elaborate costumes for different ceremonies, you needed to host expensive entertainments, you needed servants and carriages and jewels. But most importantly, you needed to be physically present, day after day, competing for access to the king's body and attention. The bathroom rituals were just one part of a much larger system where Louis had made his entire physical existence into a form of political currency. Nobles would spend fortunes just for the right to hand the king his shirt in the morning or to hold a candle during his evening routine. But the bathroom access remained the most prestigious, because it represented the ultimate intimacy between subject and sovereign. Louis even had special protocols for different types of bathroom visits. There were different levels of ceremony depending on whether it was a quick morning relief or a longer, more elaborate session. Different nobles had rights to be present for different types of visits, and the king could modify these privileges as rewards or punishments. Imagine having your political career dependent on whether the king invites you to watch him poop, but that's exactly how Louis's system worked. The most incredible thing is how Louis managed to make this arrangement seem natural and even dignified. Through careful ritual and ceremony, he transformed what should have been humiliating or ridiculous into something that looked like the height of civilized court culture. Foreign diplomats might be shocked at first, but they quickly learned that understanding these intimate protocols was essential for conducting any serious business with France. And the system was incredibly effective at its main goal, keeping the French nobility under Louis's direct control. Instead of governing their own lands and potentially plotting against the crown, they were all trapped at Versailles, competing desperately for access to royal favor. The morning bathroom ceremony became a daily reminder of exactly where power lay, not in noble blood or land ownership, but in proximity to the king's physical presence, even at its most vulnerable moments. The most insane part about Louis XIV bathroom politics wasn't just that it existed, it's how completely it consumed the lives and fortunes of France's most powerful families. We're talking about dukes who could trace their lineage back to Charlemagne, literally spending their entire wealth and dedicating their lives to gaining access to a royal toilet. But here's the thing, for many of them, it actually worked. Take the Duke of Saint-Simon, one of our best sources for understanding court life at Versailles. This guy wrote thousands of pages of memoirs, and a shocking amount of them focus on the intricate politics of who got to be present for different aspects of the king's daily routine. Saint-Simon describes nobles who would wake up at 5 in the morning, spend hours getting dressed in the perfect outfit, and then stand around waiting for hours just for the chance that Louis might nod in their direction during his morning relief. But Saint-Simon also documents how this system created real political power. Nobles who gained regular access to the king's intimate moments could whisper requests, share gossip, or lobby for their relatives at the exact moments when Louis was most relaxed and receptive. The morning bathroom session became an unofficial cabinet meeting where some of France's most important decisions got made while the king was literally sitting on a toilet. The competition for these privileges was absolutely ruthless. Courtiers would spend decades building relationships, doing favors, and positioning themselves for the chance to move up in the bathroom hierarchy. And Louis was brilliant at manipulating this system. He would occasionally invite someone new to join the morning ceremony, immediately elevating their status and making everyone else wonder what they'd done wrong to lose their king's favor. Here's a perfect example of how this worked. In 1685, Louis wanted to pressure the Duke of Burgundy into supporting his policies regarding religious minorities. Instead of calling a formal meeting or making official demands, Louis simply started excluding Burgundy from the morning bathroom ceremonies. Within weeks, other courtiers began avoiding Burgundy, assuming he'd fallen out of royal favor. Burgundy's political influence collapsed almost overnight, and he quickly came begging the king for forgiveness, agreeing to support whatever policies Louis wanted. The psychological pressure of this system was enormous. Imagine knowing that your entire family's future, your political career, your social standing, all of it depends on whether the king feels like inviting you to watch him use the bathroom tomorrow morning. Courtiers developed nervous disorders, insomnia, and what we'd probably diagnose today as anxiety attacks, all from the constant stress of competing for royal attention. But the most remarkable thing is how many nobles convinced themselves that this was actually dignified and meaningful. They developed elaborate philosophical justifications for why witnessing the king's bodily functions represented a form of spiritual communion with divine authority. Court preachers gave sermons comparing the king's morning routine to religious rituals, and nobles wrote poetry celebrating the honor of being present for royal defecation. The financial cost was staggering too. Maintaining the proper wardrobe for court ceremonies could cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Nobles mortgaged their estates, borrowed massive amounts of money, and sometimes literally went bankrupt trying to keep up with the expenses of court life. But many of them considered it worth it, because a single moment of royal favor during the morning ceremony could result in military commissions, profitable appointments, or advantageous marriages for their children. Louis also used the system to gather intelligence about his nobility. During these intimate moments, When nobles thought they were building personal relationships with their king, they would often reveal their true thoughts, their family problems, their political concerns. Louis had an incredible memory and would store away every piece of gossip, every complaint, every sign of disloyalty for future use. The craziest part is how this system spread beyond France. Other European monarchs started trying to copy Louis's methods, though none of them pulled it off quite as successfully. The English court was scandalized but fascinated by reports of French bathroom ceremonies. The German princes tried to implement similar systems but couldn't quite capture the psychological magic that made Louis's versions so effective. By the 1690s, what had started as Louis's personal quirk had become the defining characteristic of European high society. Nobles across the continent were studying reports of Versailles bathroom protocols, trying to understand how access to royal bodily functions had become the ultimate political currency. And through it all, Louis sat at the center of it, literally on his toilet, pulling the strings of European politics while answering nature's call. Here's where Louis XIV's incredible system of bodily politics finally met its match: the simple, unavoidable fact that even divine kings get old, sick, and die. By the early 1700s, after decades of turning his physical presence into the foundation of French political power, Louis's aging body began to betray the very system he had so carefully constructed. The irony was absolutely brutal. For 50 years, Louis had made his bodily functions into symbols of royal strength and divine authority. But as he entered his 70s, those same functions began to reveal his mortality in ways that undermined everything he'd built. The morning bathroom ceremonies that had once demonstrated his control over nature itself became painful reminders that the Sun King was, after all, just human. Louis's health problems started becoming serious around 1700, and here's the thing: in a system where the king's body was literally the foundation of state power, royal illness became a political crisis. When Louis developed severe constipation problems, it wasn't just a personal health issue. Courtiers would analyze the timing and quality of his bowel movements like ancient priests reading omens, trying to predict everything from military campaigns to economic policies based on the king's digestive health. The bathroom ceremonies became increasingly awkward and tense. Instead of the confident, powerful displays they'd once been, they turned into painful ordeals where France's most important nobles had to pretend not to notice their king struggling with basic bodily functions. Court physicians would crowd around during the morning routine, offering treatments and monitoring symptoms, turning what had once been intimate political theater into something more like a medical consultation. But Louis, even in declining health, understood the stakes too well to simply abandon his system. He continued the bathroom ceremonies almost until the end of his life, even when they became physically exhausting for him. He knew that the moment he stopped making his body available for these rituals, the entire foundation of his political control would begin to crumble. The morning routine had become so central to French court culture that discontinuing it would have signaled the end of his effective reign. The most heartbreaking aspect was watching how the courtiers adapted to their king's decline. These were people who had spent their entire adult lives competing for access to royal bodily functions, but now they found themselves witnessing the slow failure of the physical presence that had defined their world. Some nobles became genuinely concerned about Louis's health, but others began quietly positioning themselves for the succession, calculating how to maintain their positions under a new king who might have completely different ideas about royal ceremony. Louis's final years revealed something profound about the system he'd created. By making his physical body so central to French politics, he had created a form of government that was completely dependent on his personal presence and health. Unlike traditional monarchies where power could be transferred through institutions or bureaucracies, Louis's system required the actual physical king to maintain its legitimacy through daily performance. The morning bathroom ceremonies continued right up until Louis's final illness in 1715. Even when he was clearly dying, he insisted on maintaining the rituals that had defined his reign. Foreign ambassadors reported the surreal experience of conducting state business with a king who was obviously in severe physical distress but still insisting on receiving them during his morning routine. When Louis XIV finally died on September 1, 1715, after 72 years on the throne, it marked the end of the most extraordinary experiment in bodily politics that European history had ever seen. The system died with him. His 5-year-old successor, Louis XV, couldn't exactly continue the tradition of elaborate bathroom ceremonies, and by the time the new king was old enough to rule on his own, European culture had moved beyond the idea that royal bodily functions should be the center of political life. But the impact of what Louis had accomplished lingered for decades. He had proven that a sufficiently charismatic and determined ruler could transform even the most basic human functions into instruments of political control. The morning bathroom ceremonies at Versailles had demonstrated that power isn't just about armies or laws or money, it's about convincing people that proximity to your physical presence is worth any sacrifice. In the end, Louis XIV's greatest achievement might not have been his military victories or his architectural legacy at Versailles. It might have been proving that a king could literally sit on a toilet and still command the absolute devotion of Europe's most powerful nobles. That's a level of psychological mastery that most modern politicians can only dream about, and it all started with a simple recognition: if you can make people compete to watch you at your most vulnerable, you have achieved the ultimate form of power over the human imagination.